What's up, guys? Today we're looking at photography composition, mainly how it outranks everything as the most important thing you can do as a photographer to improve immediately. Let's get into it right after this. Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome in. Today we're talking photography composition. On this channel, we talk about everything you can do to improve as a photographer, mainly hitting on the niche of outdoor photography and landscape photography. So if you're into that kind of thing, consider subscribing below if you haven't already. But let's get into the topic today of photography composition. This is the main thing. I'm a huge proponent of this, how you can improve immediately as a photographer. This outranks like camera, lenses, everything. Yeah, you need a camera. Yeah, you need a quality lens, but over everything, you need to be able to see the frame and organize it properly to produce an adequate composition so that you can be a better photographer, construct better frames, and improve your photographs over spending money. This is the free way you can improve your photos. I'm gonna share with you some tips on how you can improve your photography immediately. Like next time you go out and shoot, these are gonna help you out. So rule number one of improving your landscape photography composition is frame organization. Now, we're talking like rule of thirds, golden mean, golden ratio, all these type of things. Learn and understand the rule of thirds and golden mean. What is the rule of thirds? Well, let's kind of look at a few photographs to figure that out. First, we're going to look at this photograph of two cacti that I shot in the Sonoran National Forest in Arizona. And as you can see in the construction of the overall photographs, you have two cacti on either side of the frame. When we're talking rule of thirds, you need to imagine your frame separated by a grid. Now, a lot of times in your camera menu and your display, your LCD display on the back of your camera, you can set your camera up to see this grid while you're photographing, but kind of visualize this in the field. When you're not even looking in your camera, when you're walking around seeing the landscape, look around, see what can be organized by the rule of thirds grid. You need to place your subjects along the grid lines. Where the grids intersect, where these little dots are, is where your subjects need to be placed, on the lines, on the intersections, wherever. This is also really important when you're thinking about horizon lines. So check this photo out that I shot in Death Valley National Park of this Joshua tree. You can see that the horizon line is on one of the third grid lines. This is a really good way to kind of help you visualize where your horizon line should go when you're out shooting and when you're framing up a subject like this Joshua tree. Now, the Joshua tree isn't itself in really the rule of thirds grid, but the bunch of the tree, like the bulk of the tree itself, is kind of lining up with one of the lines, so it's an adequate way to use the rule of thirds to your advantage. Now, I really like to use the golden mean or the golden ratio, some people might say, as my preferred method of organizing my frame. Now, what is the golden ratio? Well, it's this long algorithm that somebody came up with a long time ago. Let's throw up the golden ratio on top of this photograph that I have from Great Smoky Mountains National Park, a really cool waterfall, and you got all these swirls going on in the foreground. Really good long exposure opportunity. But if you throw the golden ratio up there, it's where all of the swirls of the ratio interconnect. And it pretty much lines up with the areas of intersecting lines on the rule of thirds grid. So you kind of got to think about where your subject placement is going to go. Are you going to place it on these grid lines where they intersect? What have you? Based on the subject that you're photographing, this can really improve your photography. Just like this photograph of a moonrise in Haiti, we have the horizon line of the mountains set up right on the top rule of thirds grid. Okay, so what's another way you can construct and frame up your subjects in your photograph? Leading lines is a huge way to do so. Leading lines are so beneficial to photography, and what they do is exactly kind of what they're called. They lead your eye into the subject of the photograph using lines. Now, these can be any kind of line. Let's take this photograph, for example, of a lighthouse that I shot in Geneva, Switzerland at night, using the pathway to kind of form a foreground and point directly at the subject of the photograph, which is the lighthouse itself. So when you go out, kind of look for these lines because they are really, really beneficial when you're trying to show somebody what the subject of your photograph is. Pretty obvious in this one that it's the lighthouse, but these leading lines help you kind of show you where that subject is. Another example is this waterfall in Great Smoky Mountains National Park in the Tremont area. This waterfall had all of these bubbles coming off of it. It was a really, high, forceful waterfall that day, had a lot of rain, had a lot of sediment in the water, so it created all these bubbles that you used in a long exposure, and you tracked the bubble movement and formed these leading lines into the photograph that kind of draw your eye back to where the waterfall actually is within the photograph. So leading lines don't have to be these concrete objects in the photographs like they were with the lighthouse. They can also be kind of these abstract visualizations that we use with a long exposure with the bubbles leading back to the waterfall. Think creatively about leading lines, when you can use them, where you can use them, how you can use them differently than most people, and those are the photographs that are going to be really, really successful for you and your composition as well. All right, guys, number 3 thing that you can do to improve your landscape photography composition is what I like to call finish the story. Finish the story of whatever you're trying to show in your photograph. What are you photographing? And can you finish the story of what it is and what is around it? What is so common for people who are starting out in landscape photography or outdoor photography is that they construct their subjects, but then they cut off the very edge, or they don't give it enough room on the edges to breathe. Take, for example, this photograph of a dogwood limb flowering in the spring in East Tennessee that I shot. Really good photograph of like details of spring, but you provide enough room on the edges and you provide the entire limb within the frame that you can see what is the overall story of this photograph, of the subject of your photograph. So you're showing the limb itself, but you're giving it enough room on that edge to breathe a little bit and get your eye out of that dogwood limb. Another example of this is a photograph I shot at a waterfall called Mouse Creek Falls in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. You have this winding waterfall coming through the rocks. What is that story? Where's the waterfall going? Kind of rethink the way you're framing your subjects and how much of your subject that you're showing in your photograph of what the entire story is. Because if you kind of cut this off and crop it down, it's not getting the same effect because you can't really see what the end result of that waterfall is. If you show that end result and crop it back out to the natural way that I composed this shot, you can see the entire path of the waterfall back down to the river. Think about your stories of your subjects, where they're going, what they're doing, what the overall idea of your composition is, and include the entire story in the photograph, because that's the way that you're going to hold the interest of your viewers of your photos. All right, guys, number 4 thing you can do to improve your photography composition: stop thinking about whatever is in your frame as a subject. I know I've kind of talked about what's the subject. Well, kind of stop thinking about it that way. Maybe a subject instead is a shape. Start thinking about the way you're composing your photographs as a collection of shapes. Overall shapes, circles, rectangles, triangles, ovals, squares. All these shapes compose an overall photograph, and everything in nature is a shape, even if you look at it abstractly. Here's an example of a photograph that I took in Death Valley. Triangles everywhere when you look at it. A sunrise like this can't be composed properly without the inclusion of some shapes. So what I did is kind of backed off of the edge of a sand dune and kind of recreated that edge, that top ridge of the sand dune, to kind of separate the foreground into 2 triangles. Really good way to use shapes in a photograph, or take, for example, combining multiple shapes in a photograph of this photo that I shot in Grand Teton National Park of a moon setting over one of the peaks of the mountains. You have the mountain as an actual triangle, and then the circle composed right over it, like the triangle is pointing to the circle, is the moon itself. A good way to use shapes within a photograph, if you simplify those shapes and kind of construct your photograph around what shapes your subject are, this is when your photographs become more thoughtful and more creative, even though they get a little bit more simplified. All right, guys, last big thing that you can do whenever you're working on your photography composition is think about layers. Are you showing layers within your photograph? You know, landscape photography composition has a lot to do with wide angle lens. How can you show this wide scene that you want to compose into this epic photograph? And wide angle lenses are awesome, don't get me wrong, but rethink the way you're shooting. Lenses can also have a huge impact on composition and especially layers. Let's take a look at this example that I shot in Great Smoky Mountains National Park of a sunrise. Now, in the Smokies, you have these ridges that just stack and stack and stack and stack. Unlike a wide angle lens that separates distance from objects, a 70-200 or a telephoto lens stacks objects closer together. So using a telephoto lens like a 70-200, like the one I have linked below in the video description of this video, you can use layers to create a good composition. Stacking, creating repetition throughout the photograph is a great way to use layers. Another example is this sunset, this dusk look that I got in Death Valley National Park. My back is to the Eastern Sierras. I'm facing Death Valley National Park, the western ridge of Death Valley, and you have this road acting as leading lines leading to this layer. The first layer is the little mounds in the midground, and then the back layer is the mountains, the western ridge of Death Valley National Park, creating this layer effect in photography. Now, layers can also be shot with wide angle lenses. Maybe you're trying to include different foregrounds, midgrounds, and backgrounds. Take an example right here of this lighthouse that I shot on the coast of Maine. You use this nice seaweed tide pool as your foreground subject, leading back to the main subject of the photograph, properly positioned within the frame using the golden ratio idea is the lighthouse, and your foreground kind of wants to lead your eye back to the subject, but it also acts as like an anchor to the bottom part of your photograph, providing this more interesting subject, anchoring the photograph down, because without it, it just doesn't have the same effect. So think about layers within your photographs. What's the foreground, what's the midground, what's the background, or how can you stack layers close together? All right, guys, do all of these things next time you're going out to shoot your landscape photography or outdoor photography. Use different lenses, visualize landscapes differently, think about shapes, look at foregrounds, look at leading lines, rethink the way you're shooting your photographs, and I promise you, you will improve your overall photography. Thanks so much for watching. If you like this video, hit the subscribe button or the thumbs up.